Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Chillinois Podcast. I'm your host, Cole Preston, and in this episode, I sit down with Dr. Karla Gage. Dr. Gage is an assistant professor of weed science and plant biology at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. There's a link in the podcast description. If you click on that link, you can see the timestamps for this episode, watch the video version of this podcast, and check out any citations that we referenced during our show. Once again, there's a link in the podcast description for this specific episode of the Chillinois Podcast. If you click on it, you can see the timestamps, the video version of this podcast, any citations we've made, and more. You can support us by making a contribution of your choice at chillinois.net/support. Please rate the Chillinois Podcast positively on whichever platform that you're listening from, and enjoy the episode. Hi, Dr. Karla Gage. How are you today?
Hi, I'm doing very well. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for sitting down with me. I'm really excited to be back at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Really quick, right off the top, folks, if you're interested in learning more and, getting a good look at the Cannabis Science Center at SIU Carbondale, just go to cannabiscenter.siu.edu to learn more. So, Karla, for folks that are tuning in and may not be aware of who you are, can you give yourself a little bit of an introduction?
Sure, yeah. So I'm an associate professor of weed ecology here at SIU. So I study weeds, agronomic weeds, right? It's a big joke now because I also grow hemp.
Yeah,
so it's of course, that kind of weed too. But I study agronomic weeds and their control in primarily corn and soybean crops. And we do a little bit of work in wheat and sorghum. And now, of course, we've added hemp to our list of crops.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, that was, a joke I had to try not to make. I'm looking at, so you were in the Canadogs newsletter, which I want to promote. If you go to cannabiscenter.siu.edu, the website I mentioned earlier, you can sign up for a free newsletter that Southern Illinois University in Carbondale is doing. It's the Canadogs newsletter. Yeah, I believe you're the Salukis, right?
We are.
So that's the Canadog. And I had to try so hard not to, I'm glad you led with it, not making a joke about the fact that you're an assistant professor of weed science. It's just funny.
It's hilarious. It's always been the running joke, right? Because we have, we have shirts that say weed science, SIU weed science on them.
Yeah, you gave me this shirt here. Folks.
Yeah. So it is a great conversation starter. It always has been because it generates a lot of interest, and then I get to tell people about our research program.
Yeah.
But now when people make that joke, I get to tell them about the Cannabis Science Center and all the work that we're doing with hemp.
Yeah. So it's not just this lame pun anymore.
It's not. It's taken on a whole new meaning. So it's really cool.
And remind me, when did this come into your professional and academic life, cannabis?
Yeah. So, the 2014 Farm Bill made it possible for universities to get licenses to study hemp. So that was the first time that prohibition on research had been lifted, for any state that wanted to, make that possible for their universities. So SIU applied in 2018, and we received our license in 2018 to grow hemp. And the first crop that we grew, it was just a small scale CBD crop just to get something started and to start growing some plants. So 2018 was our first year, but very small scale. And then in 2019, we kind of ramped everything up. We had a variety trial where we were looking at multiple cultivars of dual purpose hemp. And, that's a much different cropping system than CBD, which is a specialty crop. So trying to move beyond specialty crops, black plastic mulch with drip line, and get into direct seeding hemp into the field for a row crop. Yeah. For the production of fiber and seed.
I was about to ask the what'd you say it was? Dual purpose? Dual purpose hemp. It's not like, what people think of when they see a cannabis plant, like with the big buds and everything else. It's like a tall, lanky, skinny plant. Is that correct?
It is. Yeah. It's amazing that, it's all the same species, but there are, depending on what commodity you're interested in growing, there are all these different forms or morphologies that the plant takes.
Yeah.
So you think, that CBD hemp plant looks just like a medical or recreational marijuana plant, or high THC cannabis. So those plants look the same, but then when you start growing the plant for seed production, you plant it at a higher density, which means it doesn't branch as much, and it grows. It's a shorter plant, but it still puts a lot of energy in the stalk, and of course in the seed production, floral production. But then when you grow a plant for fiber, you're planting at an even higher density, but you're planting a cultivar that's been bred over time to grow really tall, and that's an unbranched plant with very few leaves on it by the end of the season, really.
Yeah, I think it probably looks like something that we saw. Maybe I'll display pictures now for our audience that's watching the video version of the podcast. We went to the University of Illinois. Dr. Dokyung Lee has his hemp fields down there. And like you say, that they're the CBD plants, which are grown and spaced apart. But then the dual purpose hemp is like really congested. Like I feel like I couldn't run through it if I wanted to.
No, it's pretty thick.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hemp is planted closer together. The row spacing is much tighter on that. Yeah. And even more so for fiber. So yeah, it'd be difficult to move
it's like a
through
wall. It gets really tall.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. And the taller it gets from a research standpoint, the harder it is to collect data in the hemp, right? You can't hardly get into it to take measures on the plant. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Gotcha. Well, so before we get into the other things you study, because you're involved in many more plants than cannabis, I do want to ask you about your relationship with cannabis. Like, have you always had a relationship with cannabis? Is it just that the Farm Bill happened and it's a new plant that you guys deal with? Like, what's your relationship been like with cannabis?
Yeah, from a perspective, just with it being a plant that's so heavily regulated, I've always felt that was not the proper place for that plant. So now that we have the capacity to work with it, it's just such an exciting new crop. And you would think that we would know so much about it already, but the things that are known are not based in science, right? So there's a lot of knowledge, right? There are a lot of people that have grown the plant and know a lot about the plant, but when it comes to scientific publications in the scientific literature, we are just now getting to the point that all of that's opened up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you give a few, I'm just curious, what are some examples from your perspective of where, like, some claims or some of our understanding about cannabis that isn't grounded in science?
Okay. Yeah. From a production standpoint, are you familiar with the term supercropping? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you crack the stem.
For those that are, that aren't, explain.
Yeah. So I can explain. So you would take a plant that's still in the vegetative stage, high THC plant, and you would twist the stem until you just hear a crack, right? So you're injuring the stem. And you would do that all the way up the plant, possibly the branches as well. And when you're done with that, the plant looks almost wilted, right? But within a couple of, hours, a day later, it'll start to regain its growth and begin to grow upright and repair the injury. So it's a well-known phenomenon that, it's kind of like a small dose of poison makes you stronger. Like a little bit of stress can make any organism grow better or fight disease better, upregulating the defense system of that organism. So there are a lot of very good producers that believe that increases the plant's capacity to produce yield. But from a plant perspective, knowing the classical ecological literature on that type of study, that's really difficult to prove, right? If we ever really prove anything in science.
Sure.
It's really difficult to show that there's a connection in increasing yield when you damage a plant. And that's called overcompensation. It happens with, grazers like deer that graze plants out in the wild. They may browse the top off of a plant and then it may branch. And if it produces seeds on the ends of each of those branches, you would think, well, more branches, maybe more seeds. But some of the literature, some of the work that's been done has not really shown that. So that's something that I would like to know. Does supercropping, does damaging the stems of a cannabis plant actually increase yield? Same, people trim their shade leaves when they produce. There has to be a point at which you're taking away from the plant's ability to produce carbohydrates and actually grow, right?
Yeah.
You can remove some of those leaves and there's no consequence, and it may allow the plant to redirect its energy where it's important.
And that's the logic that people place behind it, right?
Exactly. The logic is if those leaves are shaded underneath the canopy, they're not really doing anything, right? They're requiring energy from the plant for cellular repair, but they're not really giving back as much.
People think like, well, the bottom, what you yield from the bottom of the plant is just these like smaller popcorn nugs. So why not just? It's again the logic of like, let's just not even devote any energy to that, and hopefully it'll devote all its energy to the top. And are you saying there's maybe not so much evidence to support that notion?
Well, I actually don't know of any science behind it.
Sure.
It makes sense logically.
Yeah.
To a point again, but what's the threshold? What percentage of shade leaves can you remove and still see the same, or do you see better yield?
Yeah. And at what point does it become harmful to the plant? Like there comes a point where it's like, it's obviously there for some reason.
Yeah.
So like, are you taking away from its maximum capacity? Because you think of leaves as like solar panels. Exactly. So if you're taking away them, so it's like, yeah, I can see what you mean there.
Yeah. We do know, and I can't remember the percentage right now, but cannabis plants can withstand a high percentage of damage from herbivores, things munching on their leaves, and still yield the same. So it might be the same with that type of practice, removing the shade leaves. Maybe the plants do overcompensate. Yeah. The plant is really amazing in its plasticity. When you trim it or prune it or train it, it is amazing how quickly it recovers from all of that.
It really is, especially when you're growing in a hydroponic medium. Like I've seen people prune and then take a picture the next day and it's like full again. The canopy's full again. And it's crazy, that rate of growth.
Yeah. It's really amazing. So, from a weed science perspective, I was thinking it's a true weed, right? This is the perfect plant to study as a crop.
Now, you said you felt like it was overly regulated. Was there something in your life that made you feel that way? I mean, was it just as simple as you liked to enjoy cannabis and it was so regulated that you couldn't? Or I don't remember if it was the last person I talked to or not, but they said that they had an experience where a cancer patient had eaten a brownie, and they were when they saw that, they were like, what are we doing type of thing. So I didn't know if that's the type of regulations you're referring to that.
Right.
Kind of
as a medicinal plant, right? Because I've always been into the study of ethnobotany and how people use plants. So this is a plant that has an ancient history of a coevolution with humans, right? Yeah. We've shaped that plant just as much as it's shaped our culture. Yeah. So, the fact that this was something that was domesticated to be part of human society at one time, and now is, classified as a Schedule I substance, it just doesn't seem to fit like what the plant is, right? Yeah. So I'm happy to see the regulations lifting a bit, but even in our program, we still have a good number of regulations that we have to follow to stay compliant within the university and then within the state laws.
Yeah.
So it's not like we can just go out and plant hemp wherever we want now. We still have to have quite a bit of paperwork and documentation for what we're doing.
And unlike the other crops you work with, this is one of the only ones that, depending on the variables, you could be forced to throw it all out. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yes, I do. I do. Yeah. So if it tests hot, right? If the
explain
THC,
that for folks.
Yeah. So if the THC is over the 0.3% threshold by mass, then we have to destroy the crop, just like any other grower, right? Except for us, we may lose a huge investment in our research, but we're not losing. It's not like the same as a farmer losing acres of their investment. So, but on a smaller scale, we would still have to destroy the crop, but we could take data very quickly before we destroyed it. So there's a good chance that, we would be at flowering stage at that point. We could probably finish whatever study if we were in that case. But so far, so far we're okay.
Yeah. It's just such a crazy thing to even think about. Like, I joked with Buck that farming is by nature a gamble, but we're like upping the stakes. And I just wonder, as a researcher, it's got to be pretty frustrating.
It is, right? Because we're also, by working with this crop, such a new crop, we haven't had the time to see true cultivars being established. And, I'm not a plant breeder. I have a lot of respect for plant breeders, but it takes multiple generations, up to 8 generations of crossbreeding in order to get something that has what they call stable traits, meaning that if you plant 200 seeds out in the field, they're all going to come up at roughly the same time. They're going to look like roughly the same.
The way we have corn.
Exactly. Yeah, it's exactly like that. That's why cornfields are such uniform height all the way across the field, right? So with hemp, though, some of the first cultivars that we worked with, they would be a really small plant right next to an enormous plant. And, one would look like a Christmas tree and the other would be not so branched. And it was all from the same batch of seeds. And, we could see that in our phytochemistry testing too, testing for cannabinoids and terpenes.
Yeah.
Like it just seemed like sometimes the plants that we got weren't well bred. So that was some of our earlier research we used with starting the plants from seed. For the studies that we're doing now on phytochemistry, we do now clone the plants that we need.
Okay.
That way we can control that genetic piece, right? So you
achieve some consistency.
Yeah. So that helps a lot, and given enough time and enough breeding, it's going to be the same, right? We'll see cultivars that are true cultivars that have stable traits.
Yeah.
And there won't be quite that concern.
And for folks that haven't listened to my podcast and listened to me ad nauseum talk about why we should use the word cultivar instead of strain, could you tell me why?
Sure. Yeah. When I hear strain, I think bacteria.
Yeah.
Right?
Or the new strain of COVID.
Yeah. Or a virus. Yeah. It's not a term that's used with plants so much. And even the difference in cultivar and variety.
Yes.
Variety is a natural difference, right? So we see varieties of plants in nature. I will say whenever I talk about our research looking at different cultivars in the field, I will often call that a variety trial, just because that's a classic term that even still is used in agronomy, but it's not used correctly. So we should really call those cultivar trials, because a cultivar is something that you select, right? You select it for certain traits and you breed it within that population for those traits.
Yeah. This is a weird question, but I am fascinated by variety and cultivar. Is it that a variety can become a cultivar? Or are they just totally separate things?
Yeah. So I guess from a very classic botany perspective, when I see variety, that would be a population of a species that has existed in maybe a remote geography, right? So it's a population of the same species that's found everywhere else, but it hasn't had the chance to breed with the rest of its species, right? So it's adapted to whatever those local conditions are.
Yeah.
And because of that, and because there's not really been a lot of genetic exchange with other individuals outside, it may have different traits. It may look different. It may have different physiology.
Well, and it's kind of back to the idea. This kind of gets us back to some of the myths within cannabis. One of the big myths is that cannabis, you have indica, hybrid, and sativa. But it was interesting that that is kind of rooted in some historical fact, if you will. Like, it was the idea that cannabis indica was in mountains, and so because it grew in a higher altitude, it had a different structure and everything else. But then sativa, since it grew in lower altitudes or something to that extent, of course now it's been crossbred so much that but I guess why I bring that up is, would that be an example of a variety, like back in the day when it was separate and in the mountains and it hadn't bred with other types of cannabis? Is that kind of the example of a variety that you're...
or a subspecies.
Subspecies,
right?
Okay.
Yeah. So, it would be if you still considered it all the same species again.
Yeah.
But taxonomists are lumpers or splitters, right? So what one person considers an entire species, there's another person that's looking at the different traits and how the plants look differently.
Yeah.
And they're trying to break it down on how the plants look. And the most conservative characteristic is always the floral traits. Mm-hmm. So if you're ever trying to identify a species of plant, the flowers for that species are always going to look the same, and they're going to be roughly the same size. Okay. So you can take measures of the flowers and kind of go through a key and a dichotomous key and figure out what species you're dealing with. But all the other traits, leaf color, that's not a good indicator. Mm-hmm. Leaf shape, that all changes with the light levels that the plant's exposed to. So it's really difficult to look at plants and figure out, if they're truly different. So, bring in all the advances in molecular tools, and, we can really map the relationships between plants now. Mm-hmm. And that's caused a whole shift in plant taxonomy, right? We're renaming species all the time and putting them in different categories. So it's difficult to keep up with. But yeah, it's interesting to see the evolution of the nomenclature for cannabis over time. And yeah, currently it's all considered cannabis sativa with subspecies. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about, I've got one really quick question about cannabis. I want to talk about some other plants, and then we'll get back to what we're doing here at the Cannabis Science Center at SIU Carbondale. I had a question about, like, as a scientist and a researcher, is it... So my question is about, we kind of already touched about it. It's about the idea that you could plant this seed, and then depending on the variables and how things shake out, it could be considered a different plant. Like, is that, like, I just have to imagine that is frustrating, because it's what we've entered into is a legal distinction rather than like a conversation about taxonomy and what the species of the plant actually is, right? Do you get what I'm saying?
I do. Yeah. So, and I think it would be great if we could all work on our nomenclature for this, right?
Yeah.
Because when I say cannabis, and when we say Cannabis Science Center, I'm thinking hemp, because hemp is cannabis sativa.
Exactly.
Right? It's all the same. So I include the work that I do in agricultural row crops within the Cannabis Science Center. But if you say that to a state legislator, right? If you look at the Illinois law, when you see cannabis in the law, they're talking about high THC plants,
right,
or over that 0.3% threshold.
Yep.
So that's a disconnect when I see cannabis to a member of, when I say cannabis to a member of the public, they may be automatically thinking high THC when I'm just thinking about the genus of the plant.
Right.
So, you will also find the term marijuana in some laws and some legal documents.
Mm-hmm.
I was glad our state did not go with that. They originally, cannabis was used for hemp and high THC plants when we were going through prohibition, right? And then with the 2014 Farm Bill, when we began to differentiate between hemp and high THC cannabis, that's when they kept cannabis for high THC plants.
Yep.
And then they specified hemp for anything less than that 0.3%.
Mm-hmm.
So we're stuck with this, but at least we're not using marijuana, which is actually a term with some racial, connotations historically.
Yeah.
So I'm not happy that the genus of the plant that I study is now synonymous with a Schedule I drug.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you say, it's all about our nomenclature, and you're talking about genus, species, binomial nomenclature. And that's what this gets down to. And I always try to make that point. People might be at this point tired of me like belaboring on that point, but it's like when you have somebody like Mitch McConnell say, I support hemp, but I don't support its illicit cousin. It's like, as a farmer, as somebody from Kentucky, you should know that they're the same plant. I know that he's far removed from the fields and whatever, but you know what I mean? Like, to make such an ignorant comment, just add it to the library for that guy. But anyways, sorry, I don't mean to make it a Mitch McConnell roasting session, but it's the point of, this conversation. The reason I returned to that point is it's a weird area where science and politics it's like the threads have crossed, or the feeds have crossed, I think is the saying. And the politicians are telling you like, no, this is what that is. It's like, no, if you know what the genus is, it is this plant. Like, just because you wrote this in the law books doesn't make it different.
Right. And, when all the states first started out, they were regulating on Delta 9 THC, but THCA, right? You put some heat on that plant biomass, and that THC acid form converts to Delta 9. Yeah. So now, it's where the chemists and the legislators, there's a divide in understanding there. So now more of the laws are moving to total THC at the federal level, but yeah.
So, I'm looking here again, you're featured in the Canadogs newsletter. And again, I want to get back to cannabis, but I wanted to talk about some of your other interests, which include the biology and ecology of weeds within managed and unmanaged systems, efficacy of new technologies in weed control, the effects of weed management on weed population dynamics and the composition of the weed community, or weed shifts to new dominant species, all that good stuff. One of the things I want to start with, it's something that I was told when I was in biology in high school by this amazing professor that I'll never forget. You have those good teachers in life, and like if I saw this guy today, might feel weirdly about this, but I'd give him a hug because I think about him, and like he was truly a good professor. And one of the things he told me that I've always thought about, and I was excited to talk to you about this. I'm not sure if if you'd be able to give me an answer on this or not, but I thought maybe I'll just try. He was talking about the way that we farm, and the way that he was talking about how actually, like, the medians that you see within the cornfields or bean fields oftentimes are like only there because of regulations. Like there are regulations to have like a median, like some grass, some prairie land, and that the farmers will plant as much as they can wall to wall. And what he was saying is that like if we actually like kind of allowed a little bit of look, I'm kind of jumping, I'm taking a leap here, but allowed more ecology In other words, like kind of mixed some plants up instead of wall to wall. So sorry if I'm like phrasing this roughly, but do you get the concept that I'm trying to paint? And is it overall true?
I do. Well, so there's a lot to unpack there.
Sure. I'm glad I at least kind of communicated the concept.
You did. No, I know. I get it. And yeah, you're right. Often farmers with their herbicide applications will have to leave buffer distances away from the nearest trees or sensitive vegetation. They also need to leave, if they have a waterway running through their field, they really do need to leave some grass on either side of it to filter what runs into the water. And there are conservation programs for that in particular to do enhancements in agricultural fields and to use other more sustainable practices like cover crops. And I know sustainable, that term has become meaningless. Yeah. So I have to be careful when I use it. But, if we could increase the ecology in our fields, there would be less pressure on some of the practices that we currently use, right? We, for example, we only want to see one species in a field of soybeans, right? We only want it to be soybeans. Any weeds that you see in that field, if that soybean crop is genetically modified to withstand herbicide, right? If that grower is applying herbicides over the top of the soybean crop and there are still weeds in that field, they're likely to be herbicide resistant if they didn't respond to that application at all. So because we are using herbicides on such large acreages, we are decreasing diversity overall in the field, but we are selecting for certain dominant species that we can't control anymore with those herbicides. It's just like antibiotic resistance.
Yeah.
So this is one of the reasons that there are two reasons I really wanted to study hemp. One is because it really is a perfect weed. It can adapt to whatever conditions that it's in, within reason, and it can persist for a very long time, like the Victory hemp from World War II era.
Yeah,
that's still found in Central Illinois from those days. So it's an amazing plant as a weed or as a ruderal plant. But then, if we could figure out how to be successful in the agronomic production of hemp, and if we could put that in rotation with our other major crops, anything that we do to diversify that production system sort of slows that evolution, that adaptation to things like herbicide, right? So I could use cover crops. I could plant, a grass crop ahead of my soybeans to suppress those early weeds. I could, then plant my soybean crop and not rely on herbicides alone, maybe do some practices to manage the seed bank of the weeds so that I don't build up a seed bank. Then I go into corn the next year. Then maybe I do another cover crop and I plant hemp. We've now got 3 cash crops and at least 2 cover crops in that temporal rotation of 3 years. So it just becomes harder and harder for species to be dominant and evolve into problems. It's the same for insects and pathogens as well. So the more diversified our cropping system becomes, it's almost like the healthier it becomes. So we're in a problem with herbicide resistance because we've relied on herbicides only for so long. Because when you have so many acres to manage and you're a large farmer, you're limited as to how much time you have to go out and manage the weeds. So herbicides are the easy, relatively low cost solution where you just have to do things according to the prescription. So yeah, it's all about diversity and the ecology in our crop monocultures is pretty dramatically reduced.
The other thing I think about is this is another big jump here, but our yards, like the monoculture of our yards, is that the correct word? Monoculture? It's like the idea that it's just the grass, and like if there was a little bit of ecology going on.
Right. And when I think monoculture, I do think one species.
Okay.
Often in our yards, even though they look like it's all grass, you'll have some interactions, right? You'll have some different species and other things happening there, depending on how you manage your lawn. But yeah, lawns are high input areas. The amount of gasoline and labor to mow them, and then a lot of people do apply herbicides to manage. They don't want broadleafs in their grasses, things like that. So,
well, and am I correct to think that if you didn't do your yard in the traditional American way, that maybe the bugs wouldn't be so bad? Like, because it's kind of the idea that there'd be an ecology of predator and prey within.
Yeah, there would be more things to eat those bugs, right? Maybe you'd have bats flying overhead, and they can eat, almost their body weight in mosquitoes, I believe, every night. So you'd have other things that would be predators of the insects that you don't like to be there. But some of the predators maybe you don't like, because people seem to have a problem when snakes move in, So there are certain fears that people have that, there's a theory that it's an ancient human fear of tall grass systems where the predators lie in wait.
Yeah.
So everybody likes short grass. But having a lawn can be purposeful, right? If you have a lawned area directly around your house where you're going to walk and you're going to move around, it does make it easier to move about the space, right? But then, maybe don't plant so many introduced species, invasive species, as your hedgerows and ornamental plants, go with some native landscaping. And a lot of times people don't like native landscaping because it takes a couple of years to start to look pretty, right? And then it can look kind of wild and unkempt if you're into the traditional garden type, where everything's trimmed and neat and tidy. So it's just a different aesthetic, I think.
One more leap here. It's weird how these thoughts connect, but they do for me. We've jumped from the idea of introducing more, and I feel like I'm being rough with my words right now, but the idea of introducing more ecology into like agriculture, just the fields. One of the comments that he made, by the way, is not only that you would maybe have less to deal with regard to pests and everything else, but he said the yield may be in some cases better because of the fact that it was like more natural, if that makes any sense. But
that's
because that's the thing, people like plant from wall to wall. It's the idea that we got to get the most out of my real estate, and when he said that, it kind of flipped that on its head for me.
So sometimes those systems, when you add ecological complexity, you can get unanticipated interactions. You can see species that have impacts that you wouldn't have expected because you've introduced new things or you've allowed things to be there. So I wouldn't say it's always the case that you could get higher yields, but one thing about these diversified cropping systems is that they usually also build carbon in the soil. And that holds your nutrients, that holds your water for longer. So you can make it through drought periods as a farmer. After several years, you may be able to apply a little less fertility, depending on what crop you're growing. But you see benefits anyway. The soil structure gets better. Your soil microbiology is more diverse, things like that. And then you see that, all the way up the interactions there. So as far as that translating always into higher yield, though, sometimes it can be kind of up and down, right? But I guess you could say that with a typical monoculture cropping system too. If you go through drought one year and your soils aren't healthy, your crop is going to be less likely to survive that drought.
Mm-hmm.
So not always is my answer. But if you think about what some weed competition can do. And as farmers, as producers, we don't want to see weed competition because that is directly taking away from that yield at the end of the season. But in some cases, like tomatoes, for example, a little bit of competition with a tomato plant can actually increase some of those plant secondary compounds. Those are like the terpenes in cannabis, to get back to that, the things that make up the taste and the smell, right? Mm-hmm. So some of those interactions, some of the ways that you can stress plants can make them more appealing to humans.
Gotcha.
And that's one of the things we were looking at with cannabis, to go back to that a little bit.
Yeah.
One of our first studies, we had done a weed competition study with CBD hemp. And we put up to 5 weeds, water hemp plants, which is a really competitive weed in all of our cropping systems across the Midwest. So we planted 5 of these plants directly around one CBD hemp plant, thinking that we would see a reduction in yield and a change in phytochemistry, a change in the terpene profile, maybe a change in cannabinoids as well.
Sure.
So we just wanted to see what that would do. And it didn't do anything. Like even the highest levels of competition, there was no change in yield or phytochemistry that we could detect in those plants.
Interesting.
But yeah, I would think that, like herbivory, for example, if something is eating a hemp plant, plants naturally upregulate their defense mechanisms, and they would produce more trichomes with, terpenes and essential oils in them that would help them deter insects. That's what you would expect.
Yeah. Yeah. But you're saying you didn't see that in that particular experiment?
No, we didn't in that particular experiment. We're trying to investigate some insect interactions now to see if there is an herbivory response in trichome count and phytochemical profile. But yeah, I don't know. We've seen some unusual things so far. I don't have data and I don't really understand what's going on just yet, but it seems like hemp may, again, not follow our traditional expectations in that sense.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So I guess my final thought on our little tangent that we're on with this stuff, it's like, I feel like people don't, I know that people could argue that it's not as bad as it was, but like the whole silent spring, am I thinking of the right thing, where it's like,
Yeah, Rachel Carson's classic book that launched the environmental movement.
Yeah. And I just like, I don't know. I just, I see like crop dusting all the time, and I feel like we're foolish to think that like, yeah, it's totally fine. Like that's not at all, nothing you need to worry about.
Yeah. There are regulations in place that are supposed to ensure that everything is done safely.
Yeah.
But sometimes when we put herbicides in particular down, they don't stay where we put them.
Yeah.
So, that happens, and we do see, landscape level effects sometimes, impact to the vegetation around agricultural fields. That's another thing that, I'm kind of curious about. We have feral hemp in central Illinois that's been exposed to all kinds of agricultural chemicals now. So, what's the status of that impact, and is it a little bit more tolerant to those chemicals because it's been exposed for so long?
Yeah.
Those are the kind of things that I'm wondering.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the stuff you're doing here at SIU Carbondale with the Cannabis Science Center. Tell me, I mean, you mentioned a few different experiments that you have going, but I'm just interested, and I'm sure a lot of people that are tuning in, prospective students, whatever the case may be interested in some of the things that they'd get into with you. So.
Yeah. Well, I have some really great collaborators here at SIU. So we're just kind of we're still building the research program, I should say. One of the things that we've done so many studies now, it's hard to figure out what to talk about first. But one of the problems that we've seen, at least when we direct seed hemp in the spring, if we seed it too early, in Southern Illinois, we'll get strong flushes of rainfall, right? Like high precipitation events where we get an inch or two of rain, and then our soils are actually pretty heavy. So hemp likes a well-drained soil. So if we have young plants that are still trying to establish and we get a high moisture event, then a lot of times we lose that stand. So we're still trying to figure out how to miss those precipitation events because I don't think we're going to get around our soil type. Our soil type's just going to be kind of heavy. We do have
kind of like holds water.
Yeah, it does. It's less organic matter and sand, right? But it's a lot higher in silt and clay. So, and the clay component is especially bad, right? Because that holds water. But we do have heavy soils. So some of the research that we hope to be doing with students in the future are just really basic tests looking at different soil types and emergence rates with different hemp cultivars. And we have some ideas about how to take that further as well to see if there are some things that we can do, like some additives, some things that we can do to the seed that maybe will help the seed germinate and establish better, with the idea being that if the plant is large enough, then maybe it would withstand a little bit more of that moisture. So yeah, there are a number of undergraduate students that are going to come in this next semester. We try to find places for as many of them as possible if they want to do research or if they just want to be involved. Our graduate students often need help with their own studies. And I often need help in the field with the things that I'm doing. So yeah, we try to get as much practical experience for the students as we can with the resources we have.
Very cool. Very cool. What's the reception been like? Critics, people that love it. Have you seen like increased interest?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I guess if there are a lot of critics, they just haven't.
Not very vocal, or?
Not to me. Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't.
Generally speaking, critics of cannabis are a loud bunch. And so if you're not hearing them, I'm just trying to be optimistic. Maybe there's not a lot of critics.
Yeah. I don't tend to read the comments sections on news articles and things like that. So that's probably where I'd find those critics.
Yeah, sure.
But no, I think, what we're trying to do for the state of Illinois is really positive. A new row crop with new potential for farmers, assuming that we can get markets established, right? That's right now, there's no point in farmers growing a fiber row crop because there are so few places that they could sell that fiber.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make economic sense at the moment. But, maybe with some subsidy programs, more infrastructure around a fiber market, maybe that will become a viable commodity for Illinois growers in the future. So I think just simply as far as the knowledge that we're gaining in terms of, agricultural production, I think all of that's really useful. So I don't, maybe I would hear more critics if I was doing more research with high THC plants. But that's really not, as a weed ecologist, that's really not where it doesn't make sense for my research to go there, really.
Yeah.
Those high THC plants are grown in indoor cultivation or, greenhouses at least. And they don't really have a lot of ecological interactions unless, you're battling pests that have come in. So.
Have you seen an increase in enrollment? People coming in and saying, hey, I'm interested in cannabis.
Yeah, well, I've definitely seen an increase in students that are contacting me with interest, and they want to know more about the programs and what classes are offered. We do have a certificate program.
Right.
So there's more interest in that. We've seen an increase in enrollment. I don't know what it looks like for the fall as far as those cannabis students, but it's real. There are more people that, now realize that this is something that they can study and it can become a career.
Yeah.
Just like anything else. And, the great thing, it's still a plant, right? You're learning about how to produce something.
Yes.
So that knowledge is transferable to any other production system.
Right.
So there's really so much you can do once you understand the basics.
Mm-hmm. Which is something that, like, for me really demystifies it. Or I don't mean to say for me, for others that maybe are not like pro cannabis, when you really break it down that it is just a plant. Like I explained to my mom once, like I was like, the thing that makes like plants produce vegetation is the light cycle and going into fall. That's why harvest is in the fall. The days get shorter, the plant starts to realize something is going on, and it starts to produce, its vegetable, let's say. I was like, the same is true of cannabis. And when I had it broken down for me, even as somebody who's pro cannabis, I was like, that's all it is the sun just goes down earlier, or in my case, you turn off the light earlier. Cause like that was crazy. It's like, how do I get this plant to produce flowers? Oh, just make sure that it's on a 12-hour light cycle. It's like, that's it. It thinks that it's fall and it goes into flower. And it's just fascinating when you break it down like that. And so I'm glad you broke that down, because for folks that are looking to get into this program, first of all, like you said, it's something that you're still developing. But I think we should set a realistic expectation for students. It's not like you're just going to sit down and study cannabis all the time. You will get an introduction to agronomy kind of as a high level, right?
That's right. So the certificate program is housed within our horticulture program.
Yeah.
So you have to take classes like crop physiology.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all about, there's this hard science, right? It's a really interesting program though. So that interest level, I think it's very helpful when you think about students getting through the academic coursework. If there's something you like, then it's easier. And we do have, I don't know if you've spoken with him yet, but we have a new cannabis biologist here at SIU now, Dr. Jose Leme.
I haven't yet, but we just connected recently. Excellent. So we'll be talking soon.
Yeah. So we're building, curriculum. Jose is building new classes, and, he's starting his own lab. So there's a lot of potential here for students to come and learn about cannabis as a model plant.
Yeah. Do you see any students walk away from here and get into the professional cannabis industry or the legal cannabis industry? Have you seen that?
It's still so early.
I figured it might be a little early for that. Because, you just started the program. The industry is very new in Illinois.
Yeah. I do see our undergraduate students going to work for the industry around us. So there are jobs just locally around us that they're more marketable for because they've had some experience studying cannabis in particular, right?
Yeah.
Those are jobs that they're really good entry-level positions to give you experience, and then you can build on those as you decide what you want to do for your career. But really, if you think about anything in crop production, anything in marketing, anything at all, right? You can apply it to cannabis and cannabis production and cannabis sales, and it's really a whole new area.
Yeah, a whole new frontier.
It is.
Yeah, well, that's really cool. Do you have? I feel like I've seen in Jose's videos fields of hemp. Do you guys have like a hemp field here at Southern Illinois University?
We do. Yeah. So we're doing the cultivar trial again this year. And we have fields at Belleville, Illinois as well.
Okay.
So we have, our research is a bit spread out, but this is the first year that I have federal funding to study hemp. And we have a trial that's looking at weed management and the critical period of competition that causes a reduction in yield. So we are, part of that study requires hand hoeing of the crop.
Uh-huh.
So, there are certain days where we have a team out hoeing the hemp
A
field.
lot of manual labor.
Yeah, yeah. And one of our treatments has to stay weed free throughout the duration of the trial. So there are some plots we have to weed for the entire study,
Wow.
but some of them, we only weed for a week and then we stop.
And then you just let it go.
Yeah, and then some of them we weed for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks and then we stop.
Gotcha.
So with the idea being, if you're limited in your ability to control the weeds, if you only have to control them really well for 2 weeks, and that's what it takes the hemp crop to establish and then start competing.
I see.
Yeah. So
Gotcha.
it's and we have that trial, where we are removing the weeds, but we also have another management trial where we have different planting densities and we have herbicide programs crossed with that. So we're looking at the interactive effects of those two things. And right now in fiber or dual purpose hemp, there aren't labeled herbicides to use, but just within the next year, we may see a couple of products that are labeled that may have limited usefulness in our geography. They're not great for weed control, but we're also studying those.
Gotcha. Do you guys cultivate indoors at all?
We have, my lab is kind of moving away from that. So Dr. Lemay is going to do more indoor cultivation. Okay. And we're working on setting up a new indoor cultivation space.
Cool.
So I will still do some basic cannabis biology research in that space. But for the most part, I'm going to shift my focus and I'm going to be primarily focused on row crops now, more than the greenhouse production, indoor production, or specialty crop production,
okay.
Like, the black plastic with drip line. My lab won't be doing as much of that in the future.
Gotcha. Well, what are some things that you hope for the future of cannabis research? I would imagine that being able to actually study cannabis itself would be nice. I know you are studying, we've made that point that you are studying cannabis, but
right.
Like, let's do away with the arbitrary thresholds which defined what is hemp and cannabis. I imagine that's a natural next step for you.
That would be great, or just even increase the threshold to 1%, right? Yeah. Because it is an arbitrary threshold.
But really, at the end of the day, like, I just think about all the different things that as researchers you must, not even you specifically, but just researchers in general, like they have access to like pharmaceutical grade cocaine and like, like different things. And it's like, it's gotta be a little bit of trust involved,
Sure. Yeah. And, I could get, even now I could get a DEA permit and, study, cannabis with higher THC thresholds than hemp. But that comes with so much paperwork.
Kind of like I think the University of Mississippi has done for all these years or something like that. Yeah.
Right.
Gotcha.
So that's now open to more universities to do that.
Yeah.
But again, as a weed ecologist, I don't know if that sort of high THC production will ever be prevalent across the natural landscape, right? Because when you think about that, it's a medicinal crop.
Yeah.
And when you want to use something as medicine, you have to be sure that it's really, unadulterated, right? No, you should measure the microbes, you don't want molds and, any sort of chemical contamination. Growing it outdoors, you'd probably get some pollen movement. You'd end up getting seeds. So those types of things, I think we will continue to see high THC cannabis as an indoor or a controlled type crop. But yeah, it really would be great to see the regulations continue to loosen.
Yeah. And I don't know what I'm exactly shooting for. It just seems silly just because the plant could be psychoactive to have such a chokehold on the the research, because like one of the things that Buck talked to me about is like in his experiments with hens that he, giving CBD to a hen drastically cut down on their appetite, but then giving them Delta 8 THC, which is the only thing they could give because of these regulations we're talking about. All of a sudden they perked up attitude, much more lively. And I just wonder, like, again, that has a little bit more to do with psychoactivity, but I just wonder if there's something else that could be. It just seems like it's weird to have, it feels so arbitrary.
Well, it is. And, there are a number of weed species that grow naturally out in the environment. If you really wanted to experience, some sort of psychoactive effect, there are things that you could go find in the natural environment, So it doesn't really make sense to regulate it so, so carefully, I guess. But yeah, I think I hope we continue to see the federal regulations loosen a bit until, maybe it'd be amazing to one day have federal legalization.
Yeah. It just, people have already made the point, but it's sad that, when you look at cases like what's going on with Brittany Griner, it's like, oh, are you familiar with Brittany Griner, WNBA star that's currently locked up in Russia because she allegedly had a vape pen. And it's like, I definitely agree she needs to be let go and everything. It's sad that same thing happens in Indiana. That same thing happens in Iowa. There are people from Illinois. The same thing happens in Illinois. People that exceed their possession limit, we've got that arbitrary limit now, which it's like, it's better than nothing for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the fact that we continue to criminalize people for simple possession of cannabis, it's like, it's troubling. It's troubling. Yes. In a state that's legalized cannabis, people continue to be in jail. And I feel bad for Brittany Griner. I would hope that it seems like it's finally starting the conversation. Like I was at the gym the other day and I saw Brittany Griner and they're talking about cannabis on ESPN. And it's like, maybe this is what it might finally take for people to realize how foolish these policies are. Like we're locking up a young, talented athlete just because she had a pen that probably helped her, in downtime, because being an athlete's tough on your body. It's just crazy. And anyways, that's a tangent.
Well, it is crazy, but it's going to also take people like Dr. Hales to put the science to the phytochemistry, right? Because I know so many people that have been helped medicinally, but to actually put data, to document the physiological response and exactly how it's helping those people, that's a whole nother level, right? When we have the science and when we have, numbers on paper, I think we'll be able to shift the conversation even more.
Get a couple more questions as we start to wrap up. What do you think the future of cannabis research looks like? So we already kind of touched on maybe some of these arbitrary thresholds or, limitations go away. Do you have any other hopes and dreams for the future?
Well, so one of the things that I have not worked with yet is a triple crop, something that could be grown for fiber, seed, and essential oils, cannabinoids or other oils. I know there are a lot of challenges with that system, right? Because you have to optimize for one of those commodities, and the ones you're not optimizing for, they're often lower quality and harder to sell, things like that. So, but just as a system, I think it's fascinating that you can get 3 different products from one crop potentially. So that's something I would like to look at a little bit more. And I would like to think about the applications and where that could go in the future. I mean, because at that point, if cannabinoids are a byproduct, you could use them in other things, right? They're lower quality, but maybe that changes the production game, right? Because it's not so expensive to buy cannabinoids at that point. So
it's an interesting thought. It's an interesting thought for sure. Totally, just because I'm sitting down with you and you're a wealth of knowledge on a lot of these subjects. I'm just curious, what do we know about, I might be using the wrong word here, but hear me out, the ecology between plants and how plants communicate. Now, hear me out. I'm under the understanding that like the plants can often communicate with like fungi and even like transfer energy among one another. Is any of this grounded? Like, is there any proof to support this?
Yes. There is some really neat science that supports the ability of plants to communicate.
I meant to say evidence to support that. Yeah.
No, there is. You're exactly right. So plants form relationships with mycorrhizal fungi underground. And if people don't know what those are, if you go out into the forest and dig up some soil, take a shovel out and turn over some leaves, and you see those little white hair-like things growing through the leaves. That's fungi, basically. That's the mycorrhizae. And, whenever you see a mushroom that's produced, that could be that fungus sexually reproducing at that point. So the underground network of a single individual, a single fungus, could be incredible. It could be, your whole lawn, basically. And you may just see a couple of mushrooms, and that's how you know that fungus is even there. But you don't see what's going on underground. So plants can form relationships with mycorrhizal fungi. And for that entire network, that fungus can bring the plants things like phosphorus. So it can bring a nutrient to the plants. And then in exchange, the plant provides the fungus with carbohydrates. So it's a mutualism, a symbiosis. In many cases, it can become pathogenic where the fungus can take more than it gives. So that's just a piece of what's happening below ground. And plants can be connected by the same mycorrhizal fungus, and there can be some sharing of carbohydrates and reserves between those plants. So that's work that has been done by other ecologists to show that when it comes to the way that plants communicate with one another above ground, plants can actually call for help in their own way. There was work done on it's basically the wild tobacco plant. If a caterpillar munches on that plant, the plant is able to release a volatile compound into the air. It's called methyl jasmonate, and that compound can actually signal to parasitoid wasps.
And is that a pheromone? Is that what those are called?
It would in plant terms, it would be a hormone.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's this volatile hormone that's used in plant signaling. So it can call in the predators of that herbivore, but it can also alert other nearby individuals that plant is being eaten. Those individuals start producing plant secondary compounds, those nasty compounds that deter herbivory, and they're already prepared, right? So when that caterpillar tries to move on to the next plant, it's less palatable.
Look bitter. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
That is really interesting. So this gets pretty deep because it's like, I might be wrong on the details, but from what I understand, I read somewhere online, so who knows if it's true, but I read somewhere online that like going back to the 70s or 80s, people didn't really consider fish to be intelligent forms of life. They often actually, so they kind of they were like, are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yeah. I'm familiar with that idea. The idea being that their nervous systems are so much more reduced than ours.
And a common myth, I think, like when I grew up and actually down around here, and we'd fish, and Grandpa, does that hurt the fish? Oh no, fish don't feel pain like that. It's like, they probably do. That we figure, but I bring that up because it sounds like you're familiar with the idea that we've come to the understanding that fish are complex organisms, and I mean, they are aware. They have, hierarchies. It's interesting. We go to a pond nearby with, I think, a bunch of koi fish. And when you walk around the pond, the fish follow you because they know that humans equal food, because there's a little like food thing that you can feed them with. I mean, they are aware. And so plants, it's interesting. We don't think of them as, we think of them as living because they require water and, they eat things, but we don't think of them as complex organisms. But then when you hear that they have networks, we have networks, cellular networks, and they have networks to communicate with each other and get things that they need and tell each other about things that you might want to be wary of.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Right. As a weed scientist, one of my favorite things to study is allelopathy. And that's the idea that the plants can, in some ways, they have their own chemical warfare between one another. So, and cannabis is allelopathic as far as our studies have shown.
Really?
Yeah. And when I say that, so to break that down a bit, so an allelopathic compound is just some sort of chemical that a plant produces that does something in its environment. It can be positive, but normally when we talk about allelopathy, it's negative to other plants. So this compound could leach from their leaves when it rains. It could only be released when the plant dies and starts breaking down. It could be exuded from the root system while the plant is living. So this is just something that the plants put into their environment that changes it. But some of these chemicals can prevent the germination of other seeds around them, or they can slow the growth of other plants around them, or change the species of microbes in the rhizosphere around them. So plants can put these things into the environment that change it. Now, whether or not it's a benefit to the plant that's produced that allelopathic compound, maybe it's not so much beneficial, but it's just something that's produced. But cannabis and some cultivars produce more compounds than others, as you would imagine, could potentially be used to suppress weeds in this way. And that was another study that we'd done. We'd actually there's a system in agronomic production called chaff lining, where, like, when you harvest a soybean crop, for example, you would harvest the soybean seeds and you would take the finest particles of that soybean plant, and they would all be funneled into a small band behind the harvester. So you have this line of mulch behind the harvester. Well, not only is that a line of soybean particulate and mulch, that's where all the weed seeds go that are harvested with the combine. So you put all the weed seeds in the place where they're going to have the hardest time germinating, basically. So we want to see if, maybe we can use our dual purpose hemp in this chaff lining system. Our greenhouse studies that have looked at just the residue, the hemp biomass, suggests that it would suppress the germination of a lot of our problem weeds. But now, whether or not, the weeds are tall enough when we harvest the hemp plants, you have to harvest the seeds along with the hemp seeds and, get enough residue off of the hemp seeds too, that you'd create that line of mulch.
Yeah.
So allelopathy is just is a really cool thing that plants do, again, that affects their environment. Another way that they can change things around them, because if you think about, the difference between plants and animals, plants have to experience everything in one location. So they have to have all the tools to adapt to the environment just inherent within them, because they can't run away.
Yeah.
So they're doing all kinds of things ecologically that we're just not aware of. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. It's just, It's just interesting because when you look at a plant, oftentimes people just like think like, it's just a plant. Like it's just sitting there. But then when you watch a time lapse of the plant's like going doing all that weird stuff. You're like, wow, it is like, it's got a life. It's like aware of its surroundings, and it really makes you wonder, like, this is really deep, but like, what is life? Because, you start to get down, or what is intelligent life, because you start to get down to these things. I mean, a plant, I feel like, is the best example. Like, we started a fish, and it's like, you could see how you'd think a fish is stupid in some ways, but a plant, like you say, it can't run away. So you kick it, and it's like, oh, this thing's stupid. It can't even run away from me. How useless. But it's like, it's doing things that we couldn't even comprehend. Yeah. You know what I mean? We couldn't even physically do.
Yeah.
So it's,
we have no way
is intelligent life?
Yeah, no way to even sense what the plant is doing unless, we take some pretty advanced equipment and measure the volatile compounds that are being released from it. And yeah, there are a lot of things that we just have as humans no capacity to perceive.
So to close, what do you think about we kind of started with the idea that cannabis, the scheduling of it is it inhibits researchers' ability to make any factual statements about the plant. What do you think about other natural plants and fungi that we've chosen to criminalize as a society? For example, psilocybin mushrooms. Do you think there's potential there?
Well, I do believe there are also clinical trials right now to look at microdoses to treat things like anxiety and depression, maybe just depression. So yeah, again, I think it comes back to the dose makes the poison, right? I could drink enough coffee to kill myself, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, should we make coffee illegal?
Right.
So it becomes a personal choice, right? And
death can find its way into anything, is to loosely quote Hamilton Morris. People die on the toilet. People die. Doing a matter of things, having sex. Does that mean that, people shouldn't be able to have sex anymore because some people died, like it's a slippery slope, So, yeah, exactly. Like, as Americans, also to loosely quote Hamilton Morris, he's awesome. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Hamilton Morris. No, I'll have to point you in the direction of some of his material. But he said, as Americans, just as people living in a free society, it doesn't even have to be about America. You have the right to engage in certain risks. Like, we have the right to drive cars. You want to take it up a level? We have a right to drive motorcycles. We can purchase bleach, fuel, poison, rat poison. And it's assumed, though, that any adult that engages in any of these risks are aware of that and are able to proceed accordingly. And it's just weird how we've got a lot of this legislation to regulate behavior.
Yeah, and it's funny because the substances we're regulating, cannabis and psilocybin, I can't really imagine that those things would, if you look at all the other substances that are abused and any potential dangerous behavior that comes from them, like, it's just such a low threat, right?
Yeah.
Don't get in a car and drive, that type of thing. Don't put yourself in a position where you could hurt anybody. But to regulate it, it doesn't make sense at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to regulate it with the consequence of arrest. Like, it's just like, if you want to make the argument that using cannabis or dosing mushrooms is unhealthy, I could also make the argument that locking somebody in a cage is unhealthy. Is that the appropriate response?
Well, you have to think too, if we isolate, one of the active compounds and then produce a pill and market it, that's going to be treated completely different than a natural plant, in its whole plant form.
It'll have a pretty label on it and a commercial where people are smiling and saying, ask your doctor for.
It'll be regulated and prescribed.
Yeah. Well, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. Is there anything that we didn't touch on today that you feel is important? I really tried to drill home, and I'll do it one more time. cannabiscenter.siu.edu for students that are looking to, work alongside you and other folks like Dr. Buck Hales. Anything else that you feel we should mention on our way out of here?
Oh, no, just about the Cannabis Science Center, it really is about partnerships, and it just helps connect all the researchers at SIU that have an interest in studying cannabis. And then it gives us a platform to connect with all of the external partners that want to support SIU in its efforts.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of synergy there, and yeah, we're always looking for new ways to support students.
Absolutely. Well, with that said, folks, I hope you found value in this episode of the Chillinois podcast. Karla, I'd love to sit back down with you again in the future because, this is just the beginning. This is the beginning of a long road towards understanding the cannabis plant. And I am so excited that we have folks like you and others that you've mentioned that are leading the charge in doing this. I'm glad to hear that you've not faced any in your face criticism. What I had asked about earlier, I was kind of wondering if people had come in like, how dare you, that type of thing, bring this into our schools. But it's nice to hear that you haven't. But I would imagine that it was something that was on your mind. There's a heavy stigma with cannabis. So I would imagine no?
I don't know. Not really. No, I think the 2014 Farm Bill just kind of erased that in my mind.
Yeah.
If it's okay for agriculture, then, it at that point, I think it became mainstream for me. Really. Mm-hmm. I recognize the stigma is still there, but it feels like we're moving beyond it. Maybe it's just because I study cannabis and read about cannabis all the time. But
yeah, well, and I suppose to your point, when it starts popping up in Family Video and that's what happened when what you're talking about happened. It just started popping up everywhere, and everybody's pretty well okay with CBD.
Yeah.
So yeah, I could see how that would make it all digestible. But
yeah, no, I don't know. I wasn't hesitant because of any stigma, I guess.
Good to hear.
It was really just the hoops that you have to jump through, right? There's still licensing and paperwork to do to get the research done. So those are really the only remaining hurdles, in my opinion.
Well, I'd like to thank you for doing what you can to advance the cause. If you couldn't tell, the topics we started off with are very important to me, making sure that this is grounded in science, that there are evidence to support our claims, and you're doing so much to further that. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here.